Hey, what's up guys? In this video, I'm going to show you how to move, scale, and rotate any object in Blender. If you want a video with maybe a little bit less options than I'm going to give you in this one, you can check out this video right up here. It'll go a little bit quicker. It'll be kind of a more up and running version of this one, but this one's going to give you a lot more options. Just one last thing before we get started. Yes, I know this is not a default cube like how it would normally look when you open up Blender. I just thought this one would be a little bit more fun to work with. It's all going to be the same. This is an object I created myself for a recreation of one of my all-time favorite games ever, Earthbound for Super Nintendo. This is a Japanese payphone that I used in that scene that I recreated. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so first up, let's talk about moving objects. Now, the way that we move an object is first we have to left click it to select it. And you can see that we've got it selected because it's got this orange outline across the entire object. Now, what I can do then is hit G on my keyboard, which G is the keyboard shortcut for grab. And now you can see that this object is connected to my mouse, and wherever I move my mouse, this object is following. I'm gonna right click to cancel that, which by the way, right clicking is kind of the cancel action in Blender. So whether you're moving, scaling, rotating, or editing an object in edit mode, you can right click a lot of times to cancel that movement. So anyway, the best way to move an object is going to be to snap it to an axis. And an axis, if you're unfamiliar, is this red line here. This is the x-axis. This green line here is the y-axis, and we have one that you can't see here, but it's a vertical one going up and down, and it's a blue one, and it's called the z-axis. So the way that we snap it to an axis is to first select it, hit G on our keyboard, and then type whatever letter for the axis that you want to snap it to. So let's snap it to the green y-axis by hitting Y. And now you can see that no matter what I do with my mouse, it's only moving on this green line. Right click to cancel that. G and X will only move it on this red line, and then G and Z will only move it on this blue line. Now we can actually take this one step further by telling it to move on two axes or lines at the same time. Or if you want to think about it in the opposite way, we can tell it to cancel the movement on a third axis. So the way that we do that is we select it again, hit G, and then Shift is going to be like our cancel button. So if I hold Shift and then press X, you can see that it is only moving on the Z axis and the Y axis, and it's not going front and back, but it is going side to side and up and down. I'm gonna right click to cancel that. The perfect example of using this technique is, let's say that we wanna move this object across the floor. We don't want it to go higher or lower. We just want it to stay where it's at, but we want it to move or scoot across the floor. We can cancel the movement on the Z axis or the height. And the way that we do that is we hit G, Shift, and Z. So now we are moving left and right and front and back, but we're not getting higher. And so this is perfect if you want to move something across a floor or a table or something, and then that way you don't have to worry about the height. So I'm going to right click to cancel that. And then one more little tip here is Blender is set up in meters by default, and we can tell it how many meters to move by typing that in on our numpad. So what we can do is select it, hit G, and then X to snap it to an axis again. And then if I hit 2 on my numpad, you can see that it has moved 2 meters, and you can actually see that right up here in the sidebar. It is not on 0, 0, 0 anymore like it was. It's now on 2 on the x-axis. So I'm gonna Control Z to cancel that, and you can see that it's jumped back to 0, 0, 0. Now if I hit G and Y and 2, you can see that it's now moved 2 meters to the right on the y-axis. And actually, if I hit the minus button on my numpad also, it will move in the opposite direction. And I can do this on all the different axes. So if I hit G and Z and 2, you can see that it moves up 2 meters. But if I hit negative or minus, it moves down. Okay, and then let's move over into edit mode by first selecting our object and then coming up here into the top left, and where it says object mode, let's move down into edit mode. However, there is an easier way to do this, and that is just to hit tab on your keyboard. You're gonna be jumping back and forth between object mode and edit mode so much that it's just worth knowing this keyboard shortcut of tab. Now, when we get into edit mode, you'll see all these lines, or depending on which mode you're in, you might see a bunch of dots, and each of these dots is called a vertex, or if you've got multiple vertexes. It's called vertices. And we can switch between these modes by coming up here, and you can see that we're in vertex select, or here we have edge select, and all those dots go away and it's just lines now. And then we also have face select, which is kind of the same, but it takes the whole face. And you can easily swap between these modes by hitting 1 on the top row of your keyboard for vertex select, 2 for edge mode, and then 3 for face select. And I'm not gonna go through all these again, but just know that everything that we talked about as far as moving in object mode works the same in edit mode. So I can hit G for moving things, or I can snap it to an axis, and I can also cancel the movement on 2 axes, and I can also type in a number amount to move it. So it all works the same, whether you're in vertex select, edge select, or face select. Okay, so let's talk about a few other ways to move objects around. First, let's talk about this sidebar menu. And if you don't have this little menu, all you have to do is hit N on your keyboard and that will pop it up. However, you can also hit this little arrow if you want, but using N is just a whole lot easier. Now, make sure that you're in this item tab, as these other keys are not the same, and also make sure that you are in object mode and not edit mode, because you can see that it's not the same menu unless you have everything selected, but that's not what we're talking about. So let's move back into this transform and location area, and then you can see that we've got an X, Y, and Z spot in here for the different axes, and moving that number value on any of these is going to be just like snapping them to that axis. And I can also key in a number by hitting 2. I can also do -2 to go in the opposite direction. And if I want to bring it back to the center part, this is called the world origin. And all I have to do is I can select all of them at the same time, or I can do them individually, but all I have to do is hit 0 on that and it will bring it right back to the center. Now, I don't really use this menu a whole lot except for bringing things back to the center, unless I've got like something that I know I just need to move like 2 meters. Then I can use this menu and it's maybe easier. So it really just depends. Just know that it's here if you need it. If you need something more precise, this is perfect for that. We can also rotate and scale in this menu, but more on that when we get to it. Okay, next up, let's talk about the toolbar, which is this little menu on the left side of the screen. And if this is not open for you, all you have to do is hit T on your keyboard for toolbar, or you can hit this little arrow again and that will bring it up for you. Then what we do is we hit this move icon, and if nothing is showing up, that's because you don't have your object selected. So let's select our object, and there, now you can see we've got this gizmo up on our object. Now, as you may have guessed, this blue arrow is going to control the up and down movement, just like snapping to an axis is going to do. The red one is going to snap to the x-axis, and the green one is going to snap to the y-axis. Now, there's no way to cancel the movement on this one. I can hit Control-Z to undo a bunch of times, or I can select all of these in the sidebar and just hit 0 if I want to go back to the world origin. Now you can see that we've got colored squares in here also, and these are going to be just like hitting Shift when we were moving on the keyboard. So if we want to cancel the movement on, let's say, the height axis, this Z axis, we can click this blue square, and now I can scoot it across the floor just like in the example before, and it's not controlling the height. Also, this white circle is going to be just like hitting G on your keyboard. Not very efficient, so I would not do that. I'm going to bring this back to center and jump into edit mode to show you that we have all the same options in edit mode. We have the cancel, squares, and the arrows, and the white circle. So I'm not going to go through that. I think you understand that. I will say that we can also rotate and scale in this toolbar menu as well. However, we'll talk about that when we get to it. Now, I don't ever use this toolbar. Like, I don't think I've ever used it except for when I was preparing for this video. I always use my keyboard, and then every once in a while, I'll use this sidebar. Now, to get out of the toolbar, all I have to do is select this select box icon here, which is this white arrow and the orange box, and there we go. Now I'm out of the toolbar. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far and you're finding it helpful, I would love it if you would let me know by hitting the like button. Thank you so much for your time. All right, next up, let's talk about rotating an object. Now, rotating is going to be just like moving objects, except instead of hitting G for grab, we're going to select our object and hit R for rotate. And you can see that it's doing this sort of free rotate again, just like when we hit G for grab. But this free rotate has to do with the angle that we're looking at it from this 3D viewport. So every time I move the camera, it's going to rotate in a different angle, which may be helpful for you, but for the most part, the better way to rotate is going to be to snap it to an axis, just like we did with grab. So I'm going to select my object here, hit R, and then X to snap it to this red X axis. Right click to cancel. Then I've got R and Y to snap it to the Y axis, and R and Z to snap it to the Z axis. Now we cannot do the shift cancel button here to rotate on two different axes at the same time. Watch what happens when I do that. I'm gonna hit shift and Z to supposedly cancel the Z axis, but look, it's rotating actually only on the Z axis, so it does the opposite of what I want it to do, but that's okay. We don't need to rotate on two axes at the same time. If we need to do that, we can just do them separately. We'll take that one. One other thing that we can do is, just like in grab, we can type in numbers, but this time instead of units to move, we're going to rotate in degrees. So if I want to spin this object on the Z axis by 45 degrees, I just hit RZ to snap it to the Z axis, and then I type 45. And there you go, you can see that it has rotated 45 degrees. And if I hit minus, it's going to rotate the other direction. Now, again, we can take this one step further, and let's say that we want to not rotate from the center here, we want to rotate it from a different part. Well, the reason it's rotating from the center is because of this little orange dot here. That is the origin point of this object, and we can right click and set the origin to different things here, but that's not what we're going to talk about in this video. But I do want to show you how to rotate in a different way. So what we can do is, instead of changing the origin point, let's do this a little bit easier and move this 3D cursor, which is this red and white circle crosshair thing. So the way that we move that is, let's hit shift and then right click, and I'm gonna right click on the edge here. And what we're gonna do is, instead of rotating around the center of this object, let's rotate around the edge like how a door would rotate. So once I've got this 3D cursor on the edge, then I'm gonna come up here to where this box is, and instead of having it on bounding box center or individual origins or median point or wherever it was at, come up here to 3D cursor. And now when we hit rotate, let's select our object. Now when we hit rotate and Z, you can see that it's now rotating along that edge because it's rotating around the 3D cursor. And I can also snap to the Y axis, and it's rotating along that edge there, and it's still rotating along this little spot with the X axis. To put the 3D cursor back, all I have to do is hit Shift and S, and this little pie menu comes up, and I can do cursor to world origin, and that will put it right back to the 000 spot. Which, by the way, if you start editing an object and then you notice that this little orange circle, this origin, is not where you want it, you can always move the 3D cursor to wherever you want it, then hit set origin and then origin to 3D cursor, and there we go, we've moved that origin point. This is useful for whenever you start editing and making an object a lot bigger. Your origin point starts in the center of an object, like when you bring up a default cube or a plane, it's always in the center, but when you start expanding it, making it bigger, scaling it, adding to it, all that kind of stuff, your origin stays in the same spot, but you may not want it to stay there. So this is a good way to move your origin, and it will affect the way that you scale objects and rotate things. So just keep that in mind. I'm gonna put it back by hitting Control Z to undo that. And then jumping over into edit mode, we cannot rotate a single vertex. However, we can rotate a group of vertices, or we can rotate an edge, or we can rotate a face. And all the same keyboard shortcuts work the same in edit mode as they do in object mode. So I can snap it to an axis. I can also rotate by a certain amount of degrees by typing that in on my numpad. So just keep that in mind. Anytime you're in edit mode, it works the exact same. All right, next up, let's talk about rotating on the sidebar. And just like moving with the sidebar, all I have to do is make sure that object is selected, and then I can click and drag over here, or I can type in 45, or I can type in -45, and that's pretty much it. If I want to reset back to the original default rotation, all I have to do is select all of them and hit 0, and there we go. And so that's pretty much all there is for the sidebar. And then moving on to rotating with the toolbar, just make sure that you have the rotate icon selected and our object selected. And now we have a new gizmo that's popped up, and we have this white circle that if we click it, it is rotating just like if we were to hit R on the keyboard. Not very efficient, so I'm gonna cancel that by hitting Control Z. Then we have something new here. If we select this sort of gray area, this is kind of like a real orbiting, like rotate, like what I would want if I were to hit R just by itself. So this one is a little bit better. I think it's kind of crazy, but that one may be a little bit more useful for you. Gonna Control Z to cancel that again. And then, as you may have guessed, we've got the different colored lines here for snapping to different axes. So we've got a red axis here, we've got a Y axis, and we've got a Z axis here. So I can Control Z this a couple times, or I could just reset over here in the sidebar. But in order to get out of the toolbar, again, all I have to do is select this select box, which is the white arrow with the orange box around it. And now I'm out of the toolbar. All right, now let's talk about scaling objects. So what I'm gonna do is actually move this payphone out of the way and bring in a cube, because this is gonna make more sense with a cube. Because if you look over here at the sidebar, you can see that the dimensions of this cube are 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters. And if we check the dimensions of this payphone over here, you can see that it's kind of weird, like 1.19. So it's not gonna make a whole lot of sense, or it's just gonna be more complicated. So we're gonna talk about scaling with this cube. So just like grabbing and rotating, our scaling keyboard shortcut is going to be S for scale. So let's make sure that we've got it selected. And if I hit S, you can now scale on all 3 axes at the same time. And this is actually very helpful because a lot of times you do want to scale the entire thing at once. However, and you can see this over in the dimensions part over here in the sidebar as well, it's scaling all 3 axes at the same time. I'm going to right click to cancel that. And of course, we can also scale only on certain axes by hitting S and then X to only scale on the X axis. We can hit S and Y to scale only on the Y, and we can hit S and Z to scale only on the Z. Now our Shift Cancel button does come back into play here. We can scale on 2 axes at the same time and cancel the scaling on the 3rd by hitting S, Shift, and Z to only scale on the X and the Y, hitting S, Shift, and X to scale on the Y and the Z, and S, Shift, and Y to only scale on the X and the Z. Now typing in numbers makes a comeback again, but instead of degrees or units, what the number system does for scaling is it acts as a multiplier. So you can see over here in the sidebar, we have 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters. Now, if I select the cube, hit S and X, and then I type in 2, you can see that we have doubled the X-axis value. So we've taken 2, and then we've multiplied it by 2 to get 4. If I select it, hit S and Y, and then type 0.5, you can see that we have halved the size on the Y-axis. So we've taken the default 2, multiplied it by 0.5, and gotten 1. So the same thing will happen if we hit S and Z, and then let's multiply it by 1.5. You can see that we've taken 2, multiplied it by 1.5 to get 3. So it does take a little bit of math, but if you know the exact dimensions that you want your cube to be, this is perfect for that. You can also select all of them at the same time, type in 2, and you can go back to your default. Or if you want, you can select all of them. Make sure you click here so that it's not highlighted. You can even type in the multiplication key and then type in something like 2, and there you go. We've multiplied the entire thing by 2. So I'm going to Control Z to cancel all that and go back to the normal size here. And again, just like always, we can jump into edit mode and scale faces. We can scale edges. And we can also, well, we can't scale single vertices, but we can scale multiple vertices together. So all of the same keyboard shortcuts work in edit mode as they do object mode. You can snap to axes, and you can type in numbers, and you can cancel using Shift. Now moving on to scaling in the sidebar, we have 2 different spots here, kind of we have 2 different spots. We have a scale section, and then we also have a dimension section, and they're a little bit different. They all work the same as before. You can click and drag, or you can type in numbers. But if you notice, we have 2 here for the Y and 1 here for the Z. Now, if you look down here under dimensions, we have 4 under the Y and 2 for Z. And that's because when we have 1, that is sort of like the default unit size. And you can see that because our default dimension was 2 meters, right? If you remember from just a minute ago. Now, once we hit 2, we have doubled it, and that has turned it into 4. So this is like our multiplier that we just talked about, and this is like the actual dimensions. And if we take all of these and hit 1, it will scale this back down to the original size of 2 meters, or we can select all of them, hit 2, and it has doubled the entire thing, or we can select them and hit 0.5, and it has now halved them. So this is the multiplier, and this is like the actual dimension size. So I hope that makes sense. Now, to drive that idea home even further, what we can do is, let's say that we have changed this to 0.5, okay? And instead of it being 2 meters all around, it's now 1 meter all around. If I select my cube and then hit Control A and then do apply scale, you can see that it has jumped now to 1, and that is because I've applied scale. Now, what apply scale does is it takes whatever thing you have, whatever size you have, and when you hit apply scale, what it will do is it will turn it into this like 1 sort of like default unit. So now to get it back to the 2 meters that it was originally, I would have to double this to get it back to 2 meters. And this is important because a lot of modifiers and certain things react on this scale system. And if you have it set on 2, or it's something weird like, 1.235 because you've been messing with it, it's going to react differently than if it was just 1. So if you notice that a modifier, something down here, is not working correctly, it's probably because you need to apply scale. And then lastly, let's talk about scaling objects with the toolbar. So first, let's select our object and then come over here to the toolbar and click on the scale icon. And just like before, we get a new gizmo with a big white circle around it, and the big white circle is going to be just like hitting S on your keyboard. It's going to scale all the axes at the same time. Cancel that with Control Z. Then we have the red, the green, and the blue lines that we can click and drag on to act like snapping to those certain axes. And then again, we've got this different colored squares that is going to cancel the movement on that specific axis. Now, if you notice, whenever I click and drag on this green one, it's scaling from both directions or both sides of this cube. To contrast that, we have another scaling option. If I click and hold and then come over here to this new menu and do scale cage, you can see that this is not like the gizmo that we have before. It's just a bunch of dots all over the cube, and we've got a dot on each face, we've got a dot on each edge, and we've got a dot on each corner. Now what these do is, if you remember when we were scaling, it was scaling from both sides whenever I scaled on that green line. If I were to grab this one here that's on the green line and click and drag it, you can see that it's only scaling where I touched it, and it's leaving the opposite side alone. And that's important because if I grab this corner up here and on the very top, it's scaling everything except for that bottom corner. So basically whatever I click, it's only scaling that and leaving the opposite part alone. And then just like before, if we jump over into edit mode, make sure that we are in scale cage here and then select a face. It still works with faces. It also works with edges. It does not work with single vertices, but if you select more than one, there we go, it's popped up. All right, and so now you have plenty of options on how to move, rotate, and scale objects in Blender. Like I said before, I pretty much only stick to my keyboard. Every once in a while, I'll use this sidebar up here, but I never use the toolbar. And I think that's just because it kind of takes me out of the moment. Using my keyboard really helps me to focus and stay in the zone. So anyway, if you are brand new to Blender and you're not even sure how to move the camera around like this, I'm gonna leave that video for you right up here. You should check that out. And thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you in the next video.